Today on the minimum equipment list, we are talking about choosing your first sport kite. Welcome back to Skyrider Limited. My name is Jesse, and today on the minimum equipment list, we are talking about choosing your first sport kite. We are going to focus today mostly on dual line kites. There's been a lot of talk in a lot of the Facebook groups recently and in various other places online about first kites, starting out with kites, skill levels, and some other stuff like that. And I definitely wanted to weigh in, but I also wanted to offer some advice as you start navigating your journey into kiting. Obviously, there's a lot of video of people flying at high levels, and I talk about kites and mostly talk about higher end kites when I do with the kite bag tour videos. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that first kite and getting into sport kites. I have notes. You'll probably see me referencing them, and I want to be really clear that this is mostly opinion. It's stuff that I've sort of thought about my 30 odd years in kites and kiting. And I there's no right or wrong answer. Everybody is unique and everybody's learning style and journey into a new sport and hobby is going to be unique. So obviously what I believe doesn't necessarily apply to you, but this is what I would advise someone if they were first starting out and they came to me asking for some input. And it's certainly what I talk about with my friends who are in the kite industry and who some of them who own kite shops. And some of it is their opinions that I've agreed with. Some of it is my opinions that I've offered to them, and sometimes they agree and sometimes they don't. Um, but nevertheless, this is just sort of let this serve as a general guide and then refine for your own tastes as you go. So, the first thing to remember when you're choosing a first sport kite is that you're going to crash it a lot. And so, with that in mind, one of my biggest factors is durability. Um, my first sport kite was, I guess my first sport kite I did well with, and the one that I sort of love the most in terms of like kites to teach on was a kite called a Dynakite. They're no longer made, but Dynakites were relatively inexpensive as singles. They could be stacked pretty easily, so a lot of people kept flying them after and kept building bigger stacks. They're a diamond-shaped stun kite with a very simple bridle and a very simple frame. They're framed in 4 millimeter solid white fiberglass rods, and they had a plastic molded nose that joined the three rods together. Um, they were relatively inexpensive, but the point is, beginning kite should be something that you can crash and will have reasonably good hope of continuing to have that kite survive and be reusable. Nobody wants to keep breaking the kite that they're learning on and having to stop and repair it and start over again. With that in mind, price point is something that I also think is really important. A lot of people, when they get into sport kite flying, want to obviously start doing tricks. It's really important to remember that you don't need an expensive kite to do tricks necessarily. That while there are benefits to having more developed, more boutique kites, they're not necessary to learn on. And certainly, I would never expect anyone learning to fly to spend over $125. And I think in an ideal world, as new stuff hits the market, hopefully somebody will come out with a kite that's ready to fly around $50 again. I don't think there really is a good beginner kite at that price point right now, but I think that's something that would be nice to see again. So, Kite Makers, if you're listening, somebody get on that. But back on the durability thing. So simple fittings, simple rods, easy to source, something that your local kite shop can help you repair or is reasonably easy to fix if it does break, but ideally something that doesn't break. Also, remember that ready to fly doesn't mean ready to fly in everything. Let's take, for example, a beginner kite that comes with a set of lines and says it has wind range from 3 to 18 miles an hour. Well, that manufacturer has to make a choice with that line set, and they're probably going to choose like 100-pound break strength line set, which is a great line set for the middle of that wind range. It might be a little heavy at the bottom end, and it might be a little light if the kite develops pull at the top end of that wind range. But ready to fly means that it's ready to fly for the middle of its wind range, not for all of it. Um, it's also important to remember that just because a kite has a wind range of 3 to 18 doesn't mean that when you first start out, you'll be able to fly that kite in 3 to 18. Realistically, that wind range for a beginner is probably more like 6 to 12. And as your skills improve, that wind range will continue to expand. Um, if the kite is listed as beginner, intermediate, and a 3 to 18 mile an hour wind range, I would say that an intermediate flyer who has developed some light wind skills will be able to expand that wind range down. But a beginner will probably struggle on that bottom end. Light wind flying and high wind flyer require different skills. And those are things that you'll develop as you progress in the sport. So the next thing to consider as you're choosing your first kite is stability and recoverability. Unfortunately, I think a lot of beginner kites are a little too unstable. And when you first start out, you have a tendency to heavy hands. It's a natural reaction, both to panicking about something crashing, and generally, when you first learn out, your motions aren't as refined. And the problem with that is a lot of beginner kites, which tend to be smaller, aren't terribly stable. And so when you make a big gesture at them, they tend to flop on their back and get stuck. And that's a real bummer because now you're stuck waiting for the kite to float to the ground and tumbling out of the sky, and you're not flying a kite that's recoverable. So, recoverable here means that you can learn to get it out of that situation and back into a flying configuration without having to wait for it to come to the ground. Um, so, questions to ask are, is this kite stable? Meaning, will it get knocked over easily into unrecoverable positions? And is it recoverable? If I get it into that position, how well will I be able to get it out? This is where more advanced kites come into play. And luckily, there are kites coming to market that are starting to look at some of the traits we favor in more advanced kites and applying them to beginner kites. Kites like the new beginner kite coming from Canvas Kite Designs, which is, designed around that concept of recoverability. Um, Good stable kites. The Prism Neutrino is very stable for its size. It's hard to knock over on its back in flight. And I think that's another trait of like that Dynakite, and a lot of kites that do well as stackers are stable kites. So those are good things to sort of look for as we're looking for flight characteristics in our beginner sport kite. I think the last factor to consider is probably growth potential. I said earlier that you don't need a terribly expensive kite to do tricks, and I believe that. That doesn't mean that all beginner kites are going to be great for your first tricks, but most of them will do a smattering of basic tricks, and I think it's important to align our expectations of what beginning tricks and beginning skills we should master before moving on to that second tier kite. Um, I think a lot of flyers who see videos like what myself and a lot of flyers produce, who are working in a vacuum, and just seeing what they see online, are really chasing more advanced tricks before mastering more basic skills. And while I applaud the sort of desire and drive to advance in the sport, I also think it's really important that we all master those basic skills, because they'll come into play later when you want to do more and more advanced skills, or if you want to, say, fly with other people. I think it's really important to master straight line flight and good corner control, both push and pull turns, stalls and spins, and those are separate, because you can, spin into a stall, snap stall, um, push stall. There's a number of ways to stall a kite, and those skills are all going to help you learn line pressure management, which will become important later. So the last thing I want to talk about is those skills that I think are really important to master before moving on to what people think of as slackline tricks. Um, and I brought my notes out for this, so if you see me looking down, I'm reminding myself of things here. So the first skill that everyone should master is ground recovery. Whether that is the cartwheel or a magic carpet, or just generally being able to unfoul your own wingtip without taking that long walk of contemplation to the other end. That isn't to say you'll never take the long walk again. I take it frequently, and I'm not ashamed to say that, but being able to recover from the ground will keep you in the air more and to maximize your flying and learning time. So that skill is probably the first and most important for me for a lot of people. After that, landings. And there's a bunch of ways you can do landings, and there's a bunch of ways to learn to do landings. And we can do 2-point landings, and we can do tip stands, and all of those skills are, again, about line pressure management, and those are going to be important as we go along. I talked about turns and lines. Once upon a time, flying lines and turns was the height of kite control, and it still is, in my opinion. And there was a point in time where a downwards turn was a risky maneuver. And it's important to remember that you need to be able to turn your kite in both directions and have good control of it, because that skill is going to come into play later when you start to learn tricks and learn that ambidexterity for those tricks. So we talked about stalls and stalling the kite because, again, stalling the kite is spilling wind pressure out of the kite and stopping its drive, and that will be important as you progress further. Again, a line pressure management skill. And finally, slides, which are the ultimate in line pressure skill control. It is easy to do and hard to master a slide. If you practice slides and get to the point where you can do a good chunk of the wind window, that is just going to be a great skill as you progress and will teach you a lot about balancing the kite and the line pressure left to right, and really feeling your connection point out with the kite. As far as specific beginner kites, there are quite a lot of beginner kites on the market right now. From brands like Prism, Canvas is bringing theirs out, Skydog, Flying Wings. I think what's really important is finding a kite shop relatively local to you, or asking for people to point you in a direction of a kite that performs well in your environment. We talked about earlier that wind ranges aren't um, wind ranges by skill level, that just because a kite is listed as doing 3 to 16 or 3 to 18 doesn't mean that it will do that when you first start out. And so I think it's a good idea to reach out to people who fly in your area, whether it be the local kite shop or flyers in a Facebook group. Give them your location and see what they say for wind ranges, and then understand that whatever kite they point you at may not work in all wind ranges. That's why we all end up with bags full of kites, because, of course, not everything works in every wind range. With that in mind, too, just because something says it's an ultralight doesn't mean it will automatically fly in, no miles an hour of wind, or will be necessarily lighter than a standard kite. Ultralight kites can be quite heavy. It's more about lift and efficiency than it is the total weight of the kite. Total weight helps, but it's just a component in that efficiency equation. Light wind flying is a skill that takes mastering, just like lines, turns, and stalls. And it takes practice. And while a tool can help do a better job, it takes time to master, tools. So, bear that in mind as well. With high wind, the same. Flying in high wind is a different skill set as well. Learning to move your body to help control speed is a real important part of that, and often overlooked one. I think it was Paul DeBacher who said, maybe on one of the sportkite.org podcasts, that if you're standing still, you're doing it wrong. That you should always be moving your feet, and I kind of tend to agree with that. Especially as the wind moves out of the middle of the range and into what most people would consider as the extremes, either ultralight or high. Also, on that sort of note of ultralight and and terms, don't get hung up on labels on kites. Look at the actual wind range. Right now, I can list like 5 different ultralight and super ultralight terms. There's ultralights, super ultralights, pseudo super ultralights. There's even some manufacturers who've done vented ultralights. And they all have specific wind ranges that manufacturer has sort of put forward as optimal for that kite. So don't get hung up on the label. Look at what the manufacturer suggested for wind range and recommended lines, and do some thought on that, and if that applies to your environment and your application. I think it's very dangerous to just rely on a label, um, and just expect performance. It sets you up for a bad time, and it can be very discouraging if you go in just expecting something to be a magic bullet just because it says it's an ultralight or it says it's a strong. On the other end of the window from ultralights, we have vents, mid vents, extra vents, super vents, strongs, max. All of those labels are going to be for winds above the middle range, when we cross into those tens and up. And the thing is, just because it's a vent doesn't mean it won't fly in 6 or 8. And just because it's a standard doesn't mean you're done with it when the wind gets up into the teens. I think it was Scratch Bunnies used to fly, one of the World Cup teams used to fly their standards to like 16 or 18 miles an hour. They would just keep putting heavier line on the kite up to like 500 pound and use that line drag to spill air pressure off of the kite and slow it down. I'm not saying that everyone should do that. I'm just saying that that's part of choosing your equipment and understanding it, and that will come with practice and developing your skills. I really hope this video helps some of you pick your first or maybe your second sport kite and navigate through some of the terms and some of those first steps as you get into kiting. Um, I will probably end up making another video a little later on in the year where we talk about some more specific examples of beginner sport kites, and things I like about them, and maybe even some things I don't like about them. As always, thank you so much for watching, liking, subscribing, and sharing, and we will see you out there, Skyrider.